Thanks indeed, Philippe, and the other authors. I'm sorry to be brutalising you all on time. It's just that, this is a zero-sum game. There's only so much of it in the day, and if one person takes more, other people get less, or the coffee break gets less. So with that, and as a result, what's happening is we're getting less discussion on the floor too. So I would encourage Rolando to be very, very brutal, wherever he is, there he is, on time, in his next chapter presentation, Sovereign Wealth Funds, Issues in International Experience, which is joint with Harvard Holland. And thank you very much, Rolando. Thank you.
Well, first of all, on behalf of Harvard and myself, thank you very much for the very kind invitation. And this is on sovereign wealth funds. And I think that in terms of the classification that you provided this morning, it's kind of at the crossroads between empirics and policy. Now, time limitations are going to force us to be very selective in what we present from the paper in the presentation. So we will focus on what are sovereign wealth funds, what objectives governments try to pursue through them, some international indicators that we think are interesting, the operational rules and the effectiveness of these funds to foster stabilisation and wealth preservation, and the domestic operations of sovereign wealth funds that are becoming increasingly popular and raise a number of issues and that can have an important impact on public sector wealth. The paper also discusses other topics such as asset management, governance, fiscal risks, transparency, but we cannot cover them here. In a growing number of countries, governments have set up sovereign wealth funds to help achieve policy objectives and to manage a part of public sector wealth. And you have here the logos of some of these funds. Now, the motivations to create sovereign wealth funds and the international experience have varied greatly. And these funds came strongly into focus, and many of you will remember this, roughly in the mid-2000s, when the growing cross-border activities of some of the funds that were deemed by some to be opaque in their practices raised a number of concerns in recipient countries. Now, there is no really general consensus on the definition of a sovereign wealth fund. There's no single accepted demarcation between the pool of funds that the resources that the fund holds and other pools of government financial assets. And this is because of the wide diversity of mechanisms that can be construed to be funds. Sovereign wealth funds have been set up under very highly diverse country circumstances, with very different policy objectives, with different sources and permissible uses of funding, with a variety of legal bases and institutional setups. You have the Norwegian Petroleum Fund. It has no legal status. It's an account at the Central Bank of Norway, Norges Bank, to fully independent institutions with a board, with ability to do a number of things, and very, very, very varied governance and transparency principles. But as international interest in sovereign wealth funds rose, as a result of what I just mentioned, an international forum of sovereign wealth funds was instituted in 2009, and they came up with a definition after a lot of discussion, that these are special purpose investment funds that are created and owned by the general government. That is, it can be the central government or the subnational governments for macroeconomic principles, and they hold, manage, or administer financial assets to achieve financial objectives, and they employ a set of investment strategies which include investing in foreign assets. So this definition would rule out funds that are exclusively dedicated to domestic activities. Following on what was just said, the IMF's Government Finance Statistics Manual, the latest revision, 2014, took the International Forum's definition of sovereign wealth funds in the categorization that they do of the public sector. Now, sovereign wealth funds have been set up for different purposes, and in many cases, governments creating funds have pursued more than one objective. So let's go over very quickly the main objectives that governments have pursued. First, you have funds with fiscal and macroeconomic stabilization objectives. Now, these funds have been set up mainly in resource exporting countries, and as we will see later, a large chunk of sovereign wealth funds are in resource exporting countries. And a challenge for these countries, a secular really challenge for these countries, is how to manage the impact of highly volatile and uncertain revenues on the economy and on the budget and on macroeconomic stability, and to moderate the procyclicality of policy that has plagued fiscal policy in many of these countries. Now, this is a very key issue for wealth creation and development, because macroeconomic volatility and uncertainty can have very serious adverse effects on long-term growth and on wealth accumulation. Indeed, macroeconomic volatility has often been exacerbated by pro-cyclical fiscal policies, as you well know, that have led to damaging boom and bust episodes. So these funds, stabilization funds, aim to reduce the short-term impact of volatile revenues on the budget and on the economy, and to support fiscal discipline, Second, there are funds that are set up with the aim of contributing to long-term saving and the preservation of public wealth. In resource exporting countries, of course, the resources are depletable, and indeed they also run the risk of obsolescence. So savings funds aim to turn part of that natural capital, that resource wealth, into other forms of wealth for future generations. Some non-resource exporting countries have also set up savings funds, for example, pension reserve funds. These are not contribution funds, these are funds funded from the government to help finance future pension liabilities. But as money is fungible, in fact, these pension reserve funds are very much like savings funds. Third, we have this special category here, stabilization and savings funds. And we created this category because there are a few funds in some resource exporting countries that are aligned with fiscal balances. Essentially what they do is that they receive fiscal surpluses and they finance fiscal deficits. The classic example is Norway. These financing funds have both stabilization and savings objectives, and the reason we single them out is that they work quite differently from more traditional savings and stabilization funds, as we will see in a minute. Fourth, there are funds that were set up to enhance foreign exchange management. Since the early 2000s, a number of countries accumulated very large international reserves, much beyond what would have been necessary for pure balance of payments precautionary purposes, for a variety of reasons. And so some of these countries proceeded to parcel out part of these foreign exchange holdings into a foreign exchange fund that would be dedicated to manage these assets more proactively, with a different time horizon, with a different tolerance for risk, and to handle them more proactively. And finally, the national development and portfolio management. And here we should distinguish a couple of cases. First, some countries have created funds as separate entities with the authority to undertake domestic investment or to spend off budget for public policy purposes. So this means non-commercial activities that could be replicated by the budget through tax and expenditure policies. And many recent funds have development objectives in their charters. Second, some funds have allowed their funds to invest in domestic financial assets purely on commercial grounds, the New Zealand Superannuation Fund, for example, as part of portfolio management, or with dual commercial and policy purposes. Now, some indicators. The Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute reports data on the asset holdings of 75 sovereign wealth funds. The assets managed by these funds were, in 2015, a little over $7 trillion. This is not much relative to the size of the global financial market. According to, if you take the IMF estimates of the global financial market, this would be 2.5% of that market. But sovereign wealth fund holdings are highly concentrated in a few funds. In fact, if you take the top 10 funds, they hold 75% of sovereign wealth fund assets. So the differences in the distribution between averages, means, and medians are really remarkable when you look at this. The figure shows the breakdown of sovereign wealth funds into resource exporting countries in blue and non-resource exporting countries in orange. And you can see that about 3/4 of the funds are in resource exporting countries. Here we show a breakdown by age, and indeed most funds are of relatively recent vintage. The grey color of the pie shows that about 2/3 of the funds were established in the last 15 years, the majority in resource exporting countries. Depending on the case, the creation of these funds may have been motivated by different things: mounting revenues from the resource boom, the desire to moderate pro-cyclical spending during the upturn, and in a number of cases, growing interest in funds with development and domestic development objectives. Here we look at the distribution of funds that the Sovereign Wealth Fund Institute monitors according to regions and according to the income level of countries. And in the left figure, you see, again, blue means resource exporting country and orange means non-resource exporting countries. And the two tallest columns are Middle East and Asia. And half of all the funds are in these two regions, but with an important difference, because in the Middle East, it is the resource exporting countries that tend to be prevalent, whereas in Asia, it is non-resource exporting countries that have mainly set up these funds. On the right-hand side, you can see by the country income level, and roughly half of the funds are in high-income countries. Upper middle-income countries account for about 1/3. There are also funds in lowering middle-income countries. Their assets tend to be small. Now, much of the literature has focused on the fund's assets in absolute terms and particularly concentrating on very, very large funds. But for a given country, what matters more is the size of the fund relative to GDP, in per capita terms, and the role that those fund assets play in public sector financial wealth. So in terms of the distribution of sovereign wealth funds according to their size relative to the GDP, a few funds, about 16%, have asset holdings greater than 100% of GDP. But you have roughly 3/5 of the fund that hold less than 10% of GDP in assets. These are yellow and brown. Some funds that are small or even tiny in absolute comparisons are actually massive in the importance relative to their economy. Timor-Leste, the Petroleum Fund, Brunei, Libya, Kiribati are countries where the sovereign wealth fund holds several multiples of GDP in assets. Interestingly, very large funds that are often very highlighted in the literature are actually rather small relative to their economies. I mean, the classic case, of course, would be China, but also Australia and Korea. Country situations regarding sovereign wealth fund assets compared to debt, to government debt, are very, very diverse. And we have like a continuum that goes from countries that have no government debt and very large sovereign wealth fund assets, some countries in the Middle East, for example, to many countries that have very limited assets in the sovereign wealth fund and substantive amounts of government debt. So it's not just a question of just looking at the sovereign wealth fund. I mean, I don't need to mention this in this conference, but in the public domain, very often there is this excessive focalization on the assets of the sovereign wealth fund. Indeed, in some countries, sovereign wealth fund assets are not only much smaller than government debt, but the reserves of oil and gas are only 10 or 20 years at current output level. So you do have questions about public sector sustainability. So I now move a little bit into the policy. Many sovereign wealth funds in resource exporting countries have been set up with stabilization and or savings objectives. How are these policy objectives translated into the operational mechanisms for the fund and for the accumulation and the withdrawal of resources, and what is their effectiveness? And I want to really clarify that I'm not talking about fiscal rules here. This is a confusion that is often seen in the literature. These are not fiscal rules. These are because fiscal rules cover the whole of fiscal policy, or almost the whole. I mean, expenditure rules, debt rules, fiscal deficit. Here we are talking about the operational mechanisms whereby you put money into the fund or you take out money of the fund. And it turns out that the distinction between rigid and flexible fiscal rules, fund operational rules, is important. Most stabilization and savings funds have rigid operational rules for inflow and outflow. In the case of the stabilization funds, what is typical is that the trigger is defined, and then if the revenue is larger than this trigger, that or part of that goes into the fund. If it is lower, the fund can finance the budget. The hope is that the resources that you would remove from the budget during upswings will moderate spending during booms and be available to use during bad times. Savings funds have different rules. They tend to have a fixed share rule. The classic example is Q8, where a given share of total revenue has to be deposited into the fund regardless of macroeconomic and fiscal conditions. The hope is that the resources that you remove from the budget will be saved for the future. So what's the effectiveness of these rules? In principle, the effectiveness of these rigid rules is uncertain. And it is uncertain because, except in very exceptional circumstances, money is fungible. As long as there are no liquidity constraints, a government can make the mandated deposits in the fund and borrow or run down other assets to finance excessive expenditures. But on the other hand, these rules can entail costs because they have often led to tensions and inefficiency. The rules may not be right for the specific circumstances. They may create dilemmas for policymakers. For example, the accumulation rule may mandate to make deposits into the fund. But if the budget is in deficit, it has to resort to expensive borrowing or to inefficient cuts in expenditure or tax increases to comply with that rule. There is a number of examples that I could burden you with, but recently this problem has arisen in countries such as Ghana, Mongolia, Trinidad and Tobago, where despite significant budget deficits, people were obliged to borrow at very high cost to put money at much lower returns. Partly as a result of these problems, in a number of funds, rigid rules that turned out to be ill-suited to the situation that the authorities were facing were complied with at the cost of inefficiency and suboptimality. But more frequently, as policy dilemmas become dire or as political will to comply wanes or is weak, the fund rules are modified, sometimes frequently. Or they are bypassed, suspended or ignored, undermining the credibility of fiscal frameworks. How many more minutes?
The red signal is the point.
Okay, then I will cede 2 minutes to my colleague and then we are done.
Thank you very much.
Well, I'll try to be very brief then. So Rolando has been speaking about the traditional functions of sovereign wealth funds, stabilization and foreign saving, where the domestic spending goes through the government budgets. I would say a few things then about funds that invest and spend directly in the domestic economy. Rick and some other people here at Oxford started writing about this a few years ago. And even before that, there were some funds that invest directly in the domestic economy. So the main question here, in the first instance, is a question of allocation. How much of the resource revenues, if we are talking about resource revenues, are allocated to the domestic economy? How much is allocated to stabilization and saving? And then the question that follows is then how much goes to the budget and how much is invested directly by the sovereign wealth fund, and which are the criteria by which such investments are undertaken. So then you could say, for example, investments like the ones Mariana proposed, that there could be a portfolio of innovation investment, for example. Should a sovereign wealth fund do that? Well, we would argue probably not, because it's primarily a wealth manager, and how much risk should the sovereign wealth fund take on? It should take on enough risk that possibly, if it has such a mandate, that it could implement a strategy for the government, if that is the mandate. But it's a wealth manager, so it needs to have a fairly safe return and manage the assets in a way that is safe in that sense. And probably, if you have high risk, then it should, we think, that those risks should be taken on in a different way if it's a resource fund and go and be approved through the government budget. So the way we have focused this chapter, the domestic investments can be categorized in two terms. There are the policy investments, which would be that kind of investments, for example, if they're high risk, and there are commercial or near commercial investments, which could be undertaken, as was also mentioned earlier by Willem, by the Sovereign Wealth Fund, directly in the economy, where you have a combined strategic objective and a commercial objective, or a pure commercial objective of investing in the domestic economy, like the New Zealand fund. Then the third question becomes, if you make that decision that the fund can invest in the domestic economy on a commercial or quasi-commercial terms, in that case, what should the safeguards be? Sovereign Wealth Fund, it's a perfect tool to avoid parliamentary scrutiny, if you want to use it for that purpose. So you need a set of governance rules. You need to know what you're investing in. You need a framework for investing, which needs to be fairly strict. It needs to be fairly well specified what kind of risk the fund should be able to undertake. What kind of discipline should the fund be subjected to? Should it be fully commercial? For example, should it also undertake only investments as a minority shareholder to reduce the risk of political interference in its investments? Finally, time is very short. I wanted to end on a forward-pointing note. In a low-carbon world, what would be the role of sovereign wealth funds, in particular the funds that are funded by oil revenues? So we see, for example, the Public Investment Fund in Saudi, which they have announced that they will expand significantly. They have announced that they will use it for economic diversification to build up their post-oil economy. So there is a question, an open question. I'll end with an open question there of what will be the role of these pools of capital in the future as oil-rich countries, resource-rich countries wish to diversify away, or take advantage of the last bit of the era of oil to accumulate in the fund and use the fund potentially as a tool of diversification investment in the future. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Well done, both of you. Short and to the point. And as a result, we do now have, for the first time in this session, some scope for discussion. So the rewards of being on time discussion. So we have 5 minutes before the coffee break on sovereign wealth funds or the management of wealth more generally. Dieter.
I thought the example of someone like Saudi Arabia is very useful. So you said at one point that you thought you made some assumption about 20 years left or whatever. Now, if the decision for the country is what is the sustainable level of consumption, okay, then the really big number is what's the value of the remaining oil. And the sovereign wealth fund is rather trivial in that context. So if the oil price falls, or if, as I think, the oil price will carry on falling forever until we get to the end, that's a bigger adjustment than anything within the fund. Now, there's also distinctions worth making between sovereign wealth funds based on non-renewable natural resources, so it's just a question of which generation consumes the outcome, and funds which you might call like nature funds, which are when people are depleting renewable natural resources like the Amazon forest or elsewhere, and they would have radically different effects on the sustainable consumption of that. But my question really in a way is, shouldn't the rules of how you use the fund depend upon the total wealth position, including the natural asset that's being depleted, and not a narrow bit? In the Saudi case, remember too, that it isn't using its sovereign wealth fund at all to adjust. It's selling forward a chunk of Saudi Aramco precisely because it's actually using its existing fund merely to cover the 15% GDP deficit because it assumes an oil price into the future of $100 plus.
I think I couldn't agree more. And the point is here, the point that I think you're driving at is these are questions about fiscal policy. These are not questions about a fund. And therefore, to focus only on the fund is to miss the forest of public choice.
So the question, for example, about should we spend the fund on innovation is the wrong question. We should ask, what should the government spend money on, one component of which just happens to be in its accounts, what it's retained of these funds, because it's the totality of its fiscal position and its role in the state, etc., which serves the outcome, not any rule in respect to the fund. So we shouldn't have a discussion about what should the fund specifically be spent on, separate from what the government should spend on.
And the classic example of what you are saying, we saw at the time of the boom, in the latter years of the boom, when some people criticized sovereign, let's say, resource funds, because they were investing abroad. Why should these countries that are low income be financing rich countries? That's not a question for the fund. What this is saying is that if we look at domestic public investment in all the dimensions of that problem, including the fact that if I invest, that's not liquid, so I cannot use it for stabilization and so on. If it has a good return, then this is a criticism of fiscal policy. It's fiscal policy that is wrong, and the fund is simply putting away too much money.
We have time for one more comment. I'm going to actually ask Matthias to make that comment, because in my premature ecstaticism at thinking that we might have got through on time, I realised we missed the respondents' comments. So would you like to ask a question? I'm very embarrassed. Would you like to ask a question? Thank you.
Cameron, can I just I feel very uncomfortable with having such a long discussion. I wouldn't mind a few more minutes of
Cutting into the coffee break.
Okay, all right, great. Votes for cutting into the coffee break. Normally an unattractive proposition, but in this case, people are keen on it. Yes, hands in the air.
I'm asking you to finish the discussion.
Okay, yes.
Which is very big and cut off.
I was pretty much done. I can make one more point.
How you say that?
Well, I was, all right, I'll make 2 more points and then
So hold on. Let's. I'm just going to wrest back control here. Matthias, could you ask your comment? Then we'll go to Ed, and then we'll return to coffee. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, Matthias.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'd like to make 3 very brief comments. Some ideas that popped in my paper, which is a very good one, perfect addition. A perfect addition to the volume. Let's ready to our check. So first comment is, you talk a lot about the existing wealth funds, but I would be interested why some countries and in some institutional settings such a fund does not exist, especially in light of the different objectives you mentioned, the degrees of transparency in each and every country this would have been possible, the degrees of independence of these funds, and the institutional background, etc. Just to give you a few points. I missed a discussion of the moral aspects. The moral aspects, because not every country has the living standards of Norway, so you have to make a decision between spending your money on consumption versus saving money and use the dividends and the revenues of that only in the future. So that comes with a tough decision at times, I assume. And you might compare the different existing versions of these funds, and compare how good they do in terms of the returns they produce on the investment, in light of, again, the objectives, transparency, institutional setting, etc. So in short, this is a really good paper. You just may want to think about how to add 1 or 2 issues. Thanks very much.
Perfect. Thank you. A very short discussant comment. I appreciate that. Now, this highly unusual vote, popular vote for Ed to return, to eat into the coffee break, to finish off his greatest hits. Well, all I can say, democracy has spoken. Please do come up, and we'll see if we can get your slides back up, and then we'll have coffee. But you did have 10 minutes, so you're being given an excess 5. Yeah, so thank you.